A shocking revelation on Kemi's wedding day drove her out of the church hall in tears. "I can no longer marry you, Peter. The wedding is off," Kemi screamed as she ran out of the church in her wedding dress. "I will never forgive both of you," her voice breaking as she turned and headed towards the car in tears. The day had started as a dream. Kemi woke with butterflies fluttering in her stomach, excited to marry Peter, the man she believed was her soulmate. Peter was everything she ever wanted. Kind, hard-working, and devoted. The church was filled with smiling faces, their whispers of admiration following Kemi as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, and the air was sweet with the scent of roses. It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. The pastor called Kemi and Peter to the front. They stood face to face, their hands gently clasped, smiling at each other with all the love in the world. This was it. The moment they had been waiting for. They were about to take a step into forever, ready to become husband and wife. The church was silent, every eye on them as the pastor began to speak. But just as they were about to exchange vows, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Stop!" The word rang out, loud and commanding, echoing off the walls. Gasps erupted as everyone turned toward the entrance. There, standing in the doorway, was Juliet. Her chest heaved and her eyes burned with a mix of determination and desperation. She wasn't supposed to be here. She hadn't been invited. The tension in the room was suffocating. Kemi's hands slipped from Peter's as she turned to look, her heart racing. Peter's smile froze, his face pale as if he'd seen a ghost. "Juliet," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. The congregation erupted into whispers, heads craning to get a better look. Who was this woman? What was she doing here? Ignoring the murmurs, Juliet took a step forward, her heels clicking on the floor, like thunder in the silence. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "Kemi," she said, her eyes locking on the bride. "I need to talk to you. Right now." Chaos broke out. Kemi's mother stood abruptly, her face red with fury. "What nonsense is this? This is a wedding, not a place for your drama." The pastor tried to regain control. "Please, miss, this is highly inappropriate." But Juliet wouldn't stop. She raised her hand, silencing them all. "Kemi, you need to know the truth before it's too late." Kemi felt her legs go weak, her bouquet trembling in her grip. Her voice was barely a whisper. "What truth?" Peter's voice cracked as he shouted, "Juliet, get out! You're not wanted here!" But Juliet's focus never wavered. She pointed a trembling finger at Peter. "Ask him, Kemi. Ask him what he's been hiding." The room felt like it was on fire. The whispers grew louder. Kemi's head swam as her chest tightened. "Peter," she said, her voice shaky but steady. "What is she talking about?" Peter stepped forward, panic flashing across his face. "Don't listen to her, Kemi. She's lying. She's just jealous." "Jealous?" Juliet cut him off, her voice rising. "Tell her the truth, Peter. If you don't, I will." The church fell silent again, all eyes bouncing between Peter, Kemi, and Juliet. Peter looked trapped, like a man caught in a storm with no escape. Kemi's heart sank as she saw the fear in his eyes. And then Juliet spoke again, her voice breaking but firm. "Last year he cheated on you, Kemi. Forgive me, but you have every right to know." Gasps filled the church, louder than ever. Kemi's world crumbled around her as she stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't a wedding anymore. It was a nightmare. This was supposed to be the most beautiful day of her life. Tears immediately streamed down Kemi's face as she looked at Peter. Kemi and Juliet had been inseparable since childhood. They had grown up on the same street, attended the same schools, and shared everything from clothes to secrets. Kemi was the gentle, thoughtful one, while Juliet was bold and adventurous. They were more like sisters than friends. When Kemi met Peter during their final year of university, it was Juliet who had encouraged her to go on that first date. "He's perfect for you," Juliet had said, her eyes twinkling, "and if he messes up, he'll have me to answer to." For the first few months, Juliet was Kemi's biggest cheerleader. She helped Kemi pick out outfits for her dates, listened to her gush about Peter, and even helped plan a surprise birthday party for him. As Peter and Kemi's love deepened, something in Juliet began to change. The warmth in her eyes faded, her laughter sounded strained, and her once bright and genuine smiles turned into faint, empty echoes of what they used to be. Kemi noticed the change, but dismissed it, assuming Juliet was burdened with schoolwork. What Kemi didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that Juliet had fallen for Peter, the man she was dating. Juliet, bold and unafraid as always, didn't hold back. She made her intentions clear to Peter, and to Kemi's heartbreak, he gave in. It wasn't long before they started seeing each other in secret, meeting behind Kemi's back. For months, their forbidden affair continued, carefully hidden under layers of lies and deception. They played their roles so well that Kemi never suspected a thing. She could never have imagined that Juliet, the friend she trusted like a sister, would betray her so deeply. If someone had told her, she wouldn't have believed it. But the truth was far worse than any lie. Kemi had gone home to visit her mother and was supposed to return on Sunday, but she decided to come back a day early to surprise Peter. Excited and filled with love, she arrived at his apartment unannounced. Using her spare key, she opened the door and walked in quietly, hoping to catch him off guard in the best way. But nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. There, in the middle of the living room, was Peter. Her Peter, holding Juliet in his arms, her best friend, her soul sister. And they were kissing. Kemi froze, her heart stopping in her chest. The keys fell from her hand, the sound barely registering over the roar of her thoughts. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. Peter's face went pale when he saw her. "Kemi, wait. This isn't what it looks like," he stammered, stepping toward her. But it was exactly what it looked like. Juliet broke down in tears, her voice shaking as she tried to explain. "Kemi, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I was just trying to keep him company while you were away." Peter jumped in, his voice desperate. "It was a mistake. I was drunk. I didn't know what I was doing. It only happened once, I swear." Their words felt like knives. Kemi couldn't believe what she was hearing. These were the two people she trusted more than anyone in the world, and they had betrayed her in the worst way possible. She didn't scream, she didn't shout, she simply turned away, her heart shattered into pieces, too small to mend. Without a word, Kemi walked out of the apartment, cutting both of them out of her life. Their excuses, their tears, their desperate apologies, they meant nothing to her. They had destroyed her trust, and there was no going back. Now, 4 years later, Juliet stood before Kemi in the church, her presence alone enough to send shockwaves through the room. As Juliet's trembling voice filled the air, there was a grave silence in the room. Juliet's voice shook as she began to speak. "Peter cheated on you with Before she could finish, Peter's voice cut through like a blade. "You liar!" he shouted, his face flushed with anger. Kemi's mind raced back to the past. The betrayal, the heartbreak. How could she be standing here, about to marry Peter, the same man who had shattered her once before, with the same woman? "Let me finish speaking," Juliet yelled back, her voice strong now, her eyes blazing with determination. She turned to Kemi, ignoring Peter's protests. "Kemi," Juliet said, her voice breaking as tears filled her eyes. "Peter cheated on you again. This time, it was with another woman when he travelled for his friend's wedding. It happened last year." The room went silent, the words hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Kemi's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding as if it would break all over again. Her vision blurred with tears as she stared at Peter, searching his face for some denial, some explanation, but deep down she already knew the truth. "Is this true?" she whispered. "Kemi," Peter began, but his hesitation was all the answer she needed. The bouquet slipped from Kemi's hands, hitting the floor with a soft thud. Her legs felt weak, her world spinning out of control. The whispers in the church grew louder, a mixture of shock and speculation. "Kemi, let me explain," Peter pleaded, reaching for her, but Kemi stepped back, shaking her head. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice barely audible. Juliet's face crumpled with guilt. "I didn't come here to hurt you," she said. "I just couldn't let you marry him without knowing." Kemi turned to her mother, who was staring at Juliet with an expression of pure rage. "Mummy!" Kemi whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What did I do to deserve this?" Her mother, with tears on her face, shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line, unable to utter a word. Kemi looked around the church, at the faces of her family and friends, at Peter's pleading eyes, and finally back at Juliet, whose face was a mix of guilt and relief. "I need to leave," Kemi said finally to her mother, her voice breaking. Without waiting for anyone to stop her, she turned and walked out of the church, leaving behind the shattered remains of her perfect day. She cried as she ran towards the car. It was over. She could never be with Peter. Never. Later that evening, the buzzing of her phone jolted Kemi out of her thoughts. Peter's name lit up the screen. She stared at it, her heart heavy, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. With a shaky breath, she declined the call, clutching her pillow as tears streamed down her face. The phone buzzed again and again, but each time Kemi refused to pick up. Juliet had also tried calling several times, but Kemi ignored her too. She wasn't ready to hear their voices or their excuses. Then a text popped up from an unfamiliar number. "My name is Annie. We need to meet, please. It's about Peter." Kemi froze, her heart pounding. Who is Annie, she wondered, her mind racing. The message only deepened her confusion and unease. After a long, heavy pause, she made up her mind. "What could possibly be worse than what I've already been through?" she muttered to herself, wiping her tears. She decided to meet Annie, even though dread curled in the pit of her stomach. The city lights flickered through the rain-speckled windows of the garden cafe. Kemi sat at a corner table, her hands clasped around a warm cup of tea. The cafe was nearly empty, the quiet hum of soft jazz music providing a stark contrast to the storm raging in her heart. She had chosen a spot facing the door, and every time it opened, her stomach twisted. She didn't know what Annie looked like, but she had a feeling she'd recognize her the moment she walked in. At exactly 7:30 p.m., a tall, graceful woman entered. She wore a simple dress, her natural curls framing her striking features. She spotted Kemi almost instantly, hesitating for a moment before making her way to the table. "Kemi?" the woman asked softly. "Yes," Kemi replied, her voice shaky. The woman sat down, her movements deliberate, as if she were carrying a heavy burden. "I'm Annie," she said. Kemi nodded, her throat dry. "What do you want?" Annie sighed, her eyes meeting Kemi's with a mixture of guilt and sadness. "I've debated whether to contact you for months," she began. "But after I heard about your wedding, I couldn't stay silent anymore." Kemi's fingers tightened around her cup. "Get to the point," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Annie looked down, fidgeting with her hands. "I'm here because of Peter," she said. "I thought you should know. I have a child. His child." The words hit Kemi like a blow to the chest. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her world seemed to tilt, the room spinning around her. "You're lying," Kemi whispered, her voice barely audible. Annie shook her head. "I wish I were," she said softly. "I found out I was pregnant after a night Peter and I spent together. He told me it was a mistake and that he was committed to you. I decided to raise the child on my own." Kemi's hands shook as anger and heartbreak battled for control. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice rising. "Why not months ago?" "Because I thought it was the right thing to do," Annie admitted. "I didn't want to ruin what you had. But now that I see you're about to build a life with him, I realized you deserve to know the truth before taking the big step." Kemi stared at Annie, her mind racing. Could she believe her? Was this some twisted scheme, or was it the truth? "Do you have proof?" Kemi asked, her voice cold. Annie reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. She unlocked it and handed it to Kemi. There were pictures of a baby boy with Peter's unmistakable eyes, as well as text messages exchanged between her and Peter. The messages were damning. "Annie, I can't do this. I love Kemi. Please don't contact me again. I'll send money for the child, but I can't be involved. Please respect that." Kemi felt sick. She pushed the phone back to Annie and stood up abruptly. "I need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. "Kemi, wait," Annie said, rising to her feet. "I didn't tell you this to hurt you. I thought you should know before you made a decision you might regret." Kemi looked at her. "You've done what you came to do," she said before walking out of the cafe. Peter was waiting outside her apartment when she arrived. He looked messy, his usually confident demeanour replaced with anxiety. "Kemi," he said, rushing toward her. "Please, let me explain." "Explain?" she said, her voice trembling with anger. "What exactly do you want to explain, Peter? That you slept with another woman? That you fathered a child and kept it from me? Or that you stood at the altar and lied to my face?" "Kemi, it wasn't like that," Peter said desperately. "It was a mistake, just one night. It meant nothing." "One night?" Kemi repeated, her voice rising. "One night? And you created a life, Peter. A life you've been hiding from me." Peter reached for her hands, but she pulled away. "I didn't know how to tell you," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I was scared. I thought if I told you, I'd lose you." "You've already lost me," Kemi said, her voice cold. Peter's face crumpled. Kemi, please. I love you. I've been trying to fix things, to make it right. By lying to me, she interrupted. By pretending everything was perfect while you carried this secret? Do you even realize how much you've hurt me? This is not even the first time, but I forgave you. Peter fell silent, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Kemi took a deep breath, wiping her tears. I can't do this, she said finally. I need time, I need space. Kemi! Good night, Peter, she said firmly before walking into her apartment and closing the door behind her. Inside her apartment, Kemi collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. She felt like her entire world had been ripped apart. Everything she thought she knew about Peter, about their love, had been a lie. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Juliet. Kemi stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. Against her better judgment, she picked up. Kemi, Juliet said, her voice soft. Are you okay? What do you think? Kemi snapped, her voice filled with anger and pain. I'm sorry, Juliet said. I know I've hurt you in the past, but I couldn't keep this from you. You deserved to know. Kemi sighed, her anger waning as exhaustion took over. Why now, Juliet? Why come to the wedding and drop this bombshell? Because I knew if I didn't, you'd marry him and live a lie, Juliet said. I couldn't let that happen. Not after everything.
There was a long silence before Kemi spoke again. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said quietly. I understand, Juliet said. But if there's anything I can do to help, I will. I mean that. Kemi hung up without responding. She curled up on the couch, clutching a pillow as fresh tears streamed down her face. The next morning, Kemi woke to find a letter slipped under her door. It was handwritten, the words hurried and shaky. Kemi, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't say it in person. I know I've hurt you and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. But before you decide to walk away forever, there's something you should know. Meet me at our favorite spot tonight at 8. Please. It was signed, Peter. Kemi stared at the letter, her mind racing. What could he possibly have left to say? Kemi's hands trembled as she folded the letter.